Welcome back, Law and Crime Network. My name is Bob Bianchi. We are doing a Law and Crime rewind, going over the most crystallized parts of the cases. You can see that now we're doing officer-involved shootings. We just got done with Roy Oliver. At 2, we're going to start with Tremaine Wilbourn, and I got a special guest coming on with that. And then when I get off, we're going to have a new segment at 3 o'clock with the new host. It's going to be the Van Dyke trial and the cop cover-up case. All fascinating cases that we covered on the Law and Crime Network. The case selection of this crew is unbelievable, and the producers and the data and the information and the gavel-to-gavel coverage, no one does it like us. But now on the rewind, I really love it because we have our trial experts that can take all of the crystallized testimony and we can go through the points that we have all decided made the critical differences in the case. Tremaine Wilbourn, charged in an August 2015 shooting of a police officer, killed in the line of duty. The defendant and another man were inside of a Mercedes, and the police officer was executing a motor vehicle stop. One runs out of the vehicle, and then the other one shoots, that is Wilbourn, and kills the officer after multiple shots are fired. He runs from the scene. There you see that officer there. Woke up that day, didn't expect he wasn't going home. We talk about that a lot. The defendant runs from the scene, carjacks another guy at gunpoint, and 2 days later turns himself over to the police and goes on trial. This was just any kind of trial. This guy was a special kind of guy in the manner in which he conducted himself, or lack thereof, with respect to decorum and anger and agitation that got the prosecution, I'm sure his lawyers, and certainly the judge pretty agitated in the case. So we're going to cover that, but just as a little tease, got to give you a break, let all that absorb inside of you, because I got, like I said, this special guest that's coming. Normally, I don't get an opportunity anymore to be with this person. We'll go to Top Crimes, and I'll bring him in on the other end as we break this case down. Okay, my name is Bob Bianchi. I'll be here for one more hour doing the Tremaine Wilbourn case now that we covered on the Law and Crime Network. And as advertised, I have with us the guy who is also a host at the Law and Crime Network, who was in the Army for 8 years in counterintelligence, a former police officer of the Nashville PD. He's a legal analyst and law enforcement analyst on many networks across the platform, a private investigator, too, an author. He is the Renaissance man here at the Law and Crime Network. Vincent Hill, welcome to the show.
Hey, Bob, how are you, sir, man? Hey, thanks for that welcome, but I'm really not that special, man.
Well, you know when somebody is special when they say that they're not, because they don't need to go on. You have the record to go on it. We love having you here, obviously, at the Law and Crime Network, and I love working with you, my colleague. So, listen, real quick, just this Tremaine Wilbourn case, it's not bad enough that a cop gets killed in the line of duty, and the activities and actions of this guy in a courtroom, he's looking at anything for a massive, massive sentence here. But what are your initial thoughts about this guy?
Well, listen, Bob, that's why I always say these 3 words that people get confused. And I'm not talking about I love you. I mean a simple traffic stop. We hear that over and over again. A routine traffic stop. There's nothing routine in policing. And if there's one case that demonstrates that, it is this case down in Memphis where that officer, Sean Bolton, lost his life now 3 years ago.
Yes, Vincent, when I was being trained, and I know this for a fact, I've been in the law enforcement world for many years myself as a prosecutor, that the #1 way these officers are trained that they are not going to go home that night is in a motor vehicle related stop. So they are very tense, high tension on it, and sometimes with the community relations and the police ratcheting up the rhetoric, these motor vehicle stops even become more complex. Listen, it was crazy, harrowing case, but in this one, we had a kid, Chris Lanier, who was at the scene and is actually assisting and trying to get the officer help after he was shot. Let's take a quick look.
364 Delta. Y'all got a man down. What's there? Mission. 72 on Stone Line, man. Hurry up, he bleeds, man. Bad, man.
You recognize the person that was saying that?
Me?
Now, when you saw your officer, you saw a hold his shoulder.
Yes, sir.
and he was face down with his hand in his face. Did you happen to observe his weapon?
In the holster.
What did you say?
It was in the holster.
Okay, but it wasn't out.
No.
All right, we're rewinding today on Tremaine of Wilbourn. What you just listened to was Chris Lanier, a good Samaritan. Cops laying face down after being shot, gets on the officer's radio to call for assistance. There was another compelling witness in this case, Marquis Wright, who was actually a witness to the shooting as well that testified. Let's take a look at what he had to say.
And the police car pulled up, coming the other way, was it facing Little Dave's car?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Did something about the police car draw your attention to?
When the lights came on.
Okay. Was it the lights from the blue lights from the car, or was it some other kind of light?
The blue lights from the car.
Do you recall if there was another light that came from the car?
No, ma'am.
Okay, you don't recall. So when that car pulled up, Little Dave got out of the driver's side and ran.
Yes, ma'am.
And then what happened after that?
The officer walked towards the car, pulled Tremaine out.
Okay. And you said Tremaine. At the time, you didn't know his name. Is that right?
No, ma'am.
Okay, you learned his name later?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And again, I could show you.
We're going to stop you for 1 second before I forget. Mr. Wright, you said something earlier in the jury. One of the jurors indicated they could not hear what you said. So I'm going to repeat or ask this question again, and if you keep your voice up a little bit, because all these folks sitting here and the lawyers and the court reporter has to hear everything that's said in court. And the question is asked, what did you hear the passenger say when he was pulled out of the car by the police officer? You indicated you heard him say something. The juror said he could not hear what you said.
Oh, he tried to tell somebody to record him.
To record him.
Okay, so Marquis Wright is there testifying on direct examination about what he had witnessed, that the officer tried to get him out, the defendant out of the passenger side of the vehicle. There was a little bit of a tussling going on. The defendant pushed him off and then basically shot him, I think initially in the face, and then ultimately, he died, and then went later on, we'll find out, to commit a carjacking. Vincent, listen, prosecutors looking for a death penalty here. They're looking for the lengthiest sentence possible. I don't think that this case was ever a whodunit so much as it what is the appropriate punishment. So this witness, in my mind, was pretty effective.
Yeah, absolutely, Bob. And it's definitely not a case of whodunit. I mean, Tremaine later said that he did it when he went on to carjack someone. And you alluded to something earlier, Bob, how traffic stops are so dangerous. And the reason why, and it's important for people to understand, you don't know who is in that car, but more importantly, you don't know what is in that car. So when Officer Bolton approached that car for what he believed was a simple, probably drug transaction, he was not aware that Mr. Wilbourn was actually armed with a gun, and he had no chance. He shot him in the face within seconds, Bob.
Right, and obviously, when you have a death penalty, or pretty much an aggravating factor in any case, even in those states that don't have death penalty but life without parole, is the killing of a law enforcement officer in the performance of their duties. So from the cop community, having been a cop, when something like this happens, is there pretty much a rallying call that the prosecution does everything it can to seek the death penalty, both because it's a fellow officer, but also for the protection of officers, that people know that this will result in the ultimate punishment?
Absolutely. I mean, you can't let this be an acceptable practice to go out and kill a police officer who is tasked with protecting and serving the public. And that protecting and serving means sometimes putting their lives on the line. So you have to make it clear that this is unacceptable behavior, and that's why the state went for the death penalty here, Bob.
Yeah, you know, Vincent, it's always fascinated me because we talk to cops a lot about shootings and motor vehicles incidents being the highest level of hazard for them. And then we see cases in which cops don't respond to the hazard and get killed. And then we see cases where they do respond to it and may be charged with murder. It's a very tough and tricky place to be a police officer like you've done.
Damned if you do, damned if you don't, Bob.
Amen, brother. All right, listen, we're going to go to a break. We'll be right back.
Were you there when the ambulance arrived?
Yes.
Okay. Was your focus at that time on Sean and trying to get him help and loaded into the ambulance?
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Did you, after the ambulance had left, observe the scene?
Yes.
Okay. And did you observe any other vehicles besides Officer Bolton's patrol car?
Yeah, there was a early model red vehicle. I'm not sure the maker of the model. I can't remember, but I know it was a red or burgundy vehicle.
Motion for the jury what's been previously marked as exhibit number 6.
Yes, ma'am.
Is that substantially how you remember the scene
Yes.
at the time
Yes.
that you arrived there? If I could have photograph passed to the officer.
Yes, ma'am.
Officer, do you recognize what's depicted in that photograph?
Yes.
What's in that photograph?
It's Officer Bolton's vest. Also the plastic mouthpiece that we brought in to give him rescue breaths.
Is that how the scene looked the night that you arrived while y'all were working on Officer Bolton? And does it depict the location where you found him?
Yes.
We could have that marked as the next numbered exhibit. Your Honor, exhibit number 34.
Okay, you're watching Jacoba Boyd, police officer, testify as a first responder. Vincent, let me ask you as a cop, a retired cop. When I was an EMT, you would go out to these scenes, you'd see some horrific things, shooting, stabbing, stuff like that. You did your job. It's almost like you're living in a suspended animation, if it were, and you really didn't do much emotional thinking about it. And I don't know, and so it's a two-part question. What is the emotional side of that, like the officer, you see him testifying, breaking down a little bit, and two, have they improved what did not exist when I did it with regard to counseling services, and are they mandated for these guys to go to when they see something horrible like this?
Right. So, of course, this officer was responding based on his training. He said he was an EMT, he was a firefighter, so it's his training. But on the flip side to that, Bob, you saw how he almost broke down there. You had this very large guy almost breaking down into tears, which let people know police are actually human. That's what we are. We're human. We were human way before we put on a uniform. So a lot of departments have made it mandatory, Bob, to your question, to get this counseling. And I assure you, Officer Boyd probably went to some of this counseling offered through the department, maybe even at his church or wherever else he gets his spiritual advice from. I assure you he's taken this training, this therapy to cope with that. Because, again, this was several years after the shooting. He still was breaking down on the stand, Bob. This very large guy that if people saw on the street would think, oh, he's just a robot because he's a cop. But we're not robots. We're people.
Yeah, and you have no choice. There's no escaping the scenarios that you guys have to confront when you either have to run into danger or you just can't say, hey, you know what, I can't deal with this and walk the other way. You've got to put your hands, and I used to say this when I was an EMT, until you smell the blood and feel the stickiness of the blood on your hands, you just can't really articulate, or when a body is burned, that sensation that you can bring up to yourself right now. It's a different thing when you're living in that environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you said smell the blood, because I've told people that you can literally, and you know this, Bob, smell fresh blood. That's something you never forget, but you can't just say, to your point, well, I'm not going to do that. I've been to some very gruesome crime scenes, Bob, in my day, And I never once said, well, I can't do that, because my job as a first responder is to get in there, assess the situation, control the situation, and do my job.
Right. Excellent points, Vincent. That's an amazing case, and I'd like to get to a little bit more about how this guy conducted himself in trial and ultimately what came of this case. But we're going to take a break, Vincent. We'll be back on the other end. All right, we've been doing a Law and Crime, going back in time, doing a recap of the great trials that we tried here in the 2018 season, but all crystallized down to the most important testimony. We're doing Tremaine Wilbourn, accused of senselessly killing a police officer in a motor vehicle-related stop. There he is in court right now. So we've gone through a lot of the testimony in the case, but of course, always the most exciting thing is the verdict. So let's take a look.
The jury found the defendant guilty of first-degree murder as charged in count 1 of the indictment. Count 2, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of carjacking as charged in count 2 of the indictment. Count 3, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of possession of a firearm during the commission of or attempt to commit carjacking as included in count 3 of the indictment. Count 4, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of convicted felon in possession of a firearm as charged in count 4 of the indictment.
Okay, guilty. Not a surprise. This was really a case in my mind about sentencing. So we're going to go into a sentencing phase of the case. Death penalty, life without parole. Those are the options that are on the table with respect to this case. So you would imagine if you were a defendant accused and convicted of having done this, and you're in the sentencing phase of the case where the judge is going to be listening to aggravating and mitigating factors and the jury, who are ultimately deciding your fate, that you want to be as calm, cool, collected, reserved, something that says to people, hey guys, give me a break, I'm a human being. Let's take a look.
Look at it, ladies and gentlemen. Look at the face of somebody that is filled with hatred. Look at the face of a coward.
Mr. Wilbourn, it is in your best interest not to say things and use profanity. Mr. Wilbourn, it's in your best interest not to continue along this dialogue. Mr. Wilbourn, if you want to stay for the rest of the trial, you may, but this outburst will not be continued. You can step in the box then, Mr. Wilbourn. You can step back in the back.
You know, Vincent, I'm not going to lie. I mean, like, that prosecutor was really in the dude's face, okay? I happen to be one of those kind of prosecutors, too. One of the arguments the defense made, the audience needs to understand, that this is going on in front of the jury, and this outburst that he's having, it goes on in front of the jury. The judge is trying to get the jury out of there as quickly as possible. I've literally had this happen on a stand with a defendant. I was cross-examined. He got so agitated, started screaming and yelling, which I loved, and they cleared the jury out. They told him to calm down. When he was going out, he apparently said some racial epithets towards the prosecutor as well. So while I know that she was goading him, you can't help viscerally that the jury's looking at it and saying, man, this guy's an angry, uncontrollable dude. What do you think?
Absolutely, Bob, and I think the jury actually got to see the real Tremaine Wilbourn, a guy who shot a defenseless officer in the face, fired 9 more shots, 8 of those actually hitting the...
Yeah, okay. Well, you know, Vincent, you were so powerful that you literally froze because that moment needed to be frozen. You're right. The bottom line there is the jury sees the real defendant in that instance. Now, there was some testimony that came out to say that he had psychological problems, psychiatric issues or whatever came out during the mitigation portion of his case where they're trying to spare him the death penalty. I should make one note. They were willing, the defense, to take a life without parole sentence, I believe, at one point, to take it out of the death penalty, and the prosecution and defense and victim's family ultimately did not do that because they just wanted to see and let the jury make the call here. Let's go into court and watch what happens when the jury comes back with their sentencing recommendation.
The record's verdict reads as follows. We, the jury, unanimously find that the state has proven the following enlisted statutory aggravating circumstances or circumstances beyond a reasonable doubt. 1, the defendant was previously convicted of 1 or more felonies other than the present charge, the statutory elements of which involved the use of violence to the person. 2, the murder was committed for purpose of avoiding, interfering with, or preventing a lawful arrest or prosecution of the defendant or another. 3, the murder was committed against any law enforcement officer, corrections official, corrections employee, probation and parole officer, emergency medical or reserve rescue worker, emergency medical technician, paramedic or firefighter who was engaged in performance of official duties, and the defendant knew or knowingly should have known that such action was a law enforcement officer, such victim rather, was a law enforcement officer, corrections official, corrections employee, probation and parole officer, emergency medical or rescue worker, emergency medical technician, paramedic, or firefighter engaged in the performance of official duties. We, the jury, unanimously find that such statutory aggravating circumstance or circumstances do not outweigh any mitigating circumstances beyond a reasonable doubt. Therefore, we, the jury, unanimously agree that the defendant shall be sentenced to imprisonment for life without possibility of parole, and this verdict is signed by all 12 members of the jury.
Okay, so Vincent, there's no death penalty in that case. So despite the heinous nature of the crime, despite the outburst, which I thought would have been really bad for him in the case, he's getting a life without parole sentence. And, you know, fair enough, that's what the jurors decided after listening to all the aggravating and mitigating factors in the case. So, Vincent, being a former officer, how do the cops look at this case? Do they see it as a just verdict?
I think they're 50-50. Granted, he won't get out of prison. We know that. But at the end of the day, he killed a law enforcement officer who was simply doing his job. He didn't go out that day with the intent to track down Tremaine Wilbourn, to harass him or anything like that. We heard about race in this case. It had nothing to do with that. Officer Bolton was simply doing his job. And as a result of that, he died there on the street. So I think it's 50-50. Yes, he won't get out of prison, but at the same time, I mean, where is the justice for Sean Bolton? Yeah,
and it was kind of surprising to me, in addition to just that he just makes a terrible appearance, he's angry and agitated in the court, he pops off where they have to clear the jury out of the room, but there were a lot of other aggravating factors in the case, not just that he was a police officer. It would have seemed to have been a very good death penalty. In that state, Vincent, is it hard to get a death penalty kind of state?
Yeah, it is kind of hard. I mean, it is Tennessee. It's not Texas, if you will. You know, Texas is really easy to get a death penalty case in the state of Texas. But the state of Tennessee, you have a demographic of a lot of different cultures, backgrounds, economic, racial. So it's really hard to get a death penalty, even for something as heinous as this, Bob.
Wow, that's amazing. But listen, hey, Vincent, appreciate that. I know that we got a kind of special segment that's going to be coming up here on the Law and Crime Network. We are going to be breaking down some developments in the Kelsey Bereth case. The fiance, as you know, was arrested, Patrick Frazee, 32 years old, boyfriend, fiance, for her murder. The body has not been found in the case. I've been doing some TV commentary on the case. You see a picture of them right now. I think this is going to be one of those fascinating cases, and the forensics that are going on. I listened to the press conference. We have some updates today about that particular case that you need to hear about. Me and Vincent will go over them, and we'll be back on the other end of the break. Stick with us. A case coming to us from outside of Colorado that I am sure the Law and Crime Network is going to be following. It is a twisted tale already. You see a picture right there. Kelsey Barrett, 29 years old, with her little infant baby, and the man you see behind them, Patrick Frazee, has been arrested last week for her disappearance and her murder. Now, to set the facts up of this case so that you have a general idea of what went on here, there he is in his prison outfit, not that nice family portrait any longer. What happened was around Thanksgiving was the last time that anybody saw her. Supposedly, Kelsey dropped off their daughter to him, and then she went missing. The last thing that they had was a videotape of her in a store doing some shopping, and then she just went off the map. Her phone winds up pinging off towers in Idaho. Text messages go to her employer indicating she's not going to be around there for the next week. And everyone that knows it, especially mom, right? The mother's instinct, she knows this is not her daughter. She would not leave her one-year-old baby in the hands of Patrick Frazee. She would not take off work like that. She was very responsible, and nobody hears from her. She goes off the grid, if you will. So, of course, Patrick at the time is alleged to have cooperated with law enforcement up to and including giving DNA samples to the cops. Now, I said at the time, I found it unusual that they were taking DNA samples from him unless they were trying to match it to some evidence that may or may not have been collected. But they may have smartly been saying, let me get it now while he's willing to volunteer it. And I'm going to talk to Vincent about this in a second. Vincent, in these cases that I have investigated and prosecuted where there's a domestic homicide case, the person who commits the murder feels they must speak to the police because they're trying to assist in finding her or finding the person that did the evil doing, even if it's them. They realize that if they don't cooperate with police, that there are going to be big-time red flags going up on the radar as having been the murderer. So we used to use that to our advantage. But you want to help, right? You want to help find her. You want to help find your baby's mother and all of those kind of pressure points. But he doesn't report her missing. Weeks later, mom does. Now, this kind of investigation went to a dark hole. These prosecutors and cops have been pretty tight with the data and information. But they made an arrest last week, and what we found out in that arrest is they still do not have a body. And the second thing that I found to be fascinating, Vincent, is they charged him with solicitation of murder. Murder and solicitation of murder. And a solicitation of murder is a fancy way to say that they tried to get somebody to do the murder, whether that's hire a hitman or not. My last point before I throw it to you, Vincent, because I know you got some developments based on evidence that happened, and I have some courtroom developments that happened, was that we basically developed a profile from what we're reading that there was a van or a truck that was there at a certain point in time, close in time, by her home, which they believe now the police is where the murder occurred, and it went to a garbage dump. And there were people that actually witnessed two men getting out of a car, both at the scene of her home and then at a garbage dump, and identified, I believe it is at the garbage dump, that Patrick Frazee was one of the people in the truck, but he never got out. The two people in the cars got out and were dumping things. So obviously, in my opinion, law enforcement, in order to get a probable cause affidavit for an arrest where there has not been a body found, to me, somebody's cooperating. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely, Bob. Someone is cooperating, hence the solicitation of murder charge. Now, I, too, have talked about this case, done commentary about it. And the one thing I said initially, they hadn't named him a suspect, but his actions, of course, were very suspicious. Then we learned her phone pinged 700 miles away. She has family close to that area. A stranger definitely would not know this to take that phone 700 miles away to Idaho to where she has family. And now we're learning that other evidence, police have not released it for obvious reasons. What evidence? Other evidence has been found in Idaho as well. The only thing that ever made sense in this case, Bob, was what we have now, that the fiancé is now in jail pending those charges of solicitation of murder and murder. It's the only thing that made sense. No one goes grocery shopping on Thanksgiving Day, asks their mom for a recipe, and then decide, oh, I'm just going to leave town for a week. I'm going to leave my one-year-old here with my fiancé, and my fiancé is not going to call me. Now, listen, my kids are 23 and 17, but if my ex-wife was gone for any amount of time when I had a one-year-old, you better believe I was calling to find out where they are. So again, his actions were very suspicious from the very beginning, Bob.
Yeah, they were, Vincent. And, you know, a development, what I found also interesting as a prosecutor, boy, we used to have a lot of debates about this. What can you release to the public and what can't you? And, you know, when I first got into office and I was the person responsible for doing these press conferences, there are some things I noticed that are very different. First off, the prosecutor should be doing the press conference. This is now a prosecution. There has been an arrest made. It is no longer, in my opinion, a straight law enforcement function. And the reason for that is prosecutors are responsible. There's been a lot of cases where there's been a problem with this. Typically, when cops are defendants in cases where prosecutors are saying things in the public arena that are prejudicing the judicial process. But these prosecutors and cops were very tight to the lips. They basically are saying we're going to file our things in our court documents, and you can see them there. The defense made a motion to put like a gag order essentially in today, and the court said, oh, no, wait a second. The prosecutors know what their ethics rules are, what they can say and what they can't say, but there is a public interest in making sure that information and data is released by law enforcement, then the public has essentially a right to know. And that can be a very, very difficult thing when you're trying to balance those situations. Just generally speaking, I know the cops helped with the arrest, but to me these press conferences, because of those legal issues that are so particular, should be in one hand. Prosecutor, once there's an arrest, and that's it. Law enforcement should be out of it.
No, I agree 100%, Bob, because to your point, after an arrest is made, it is in the hands of the prosecution. It is their duty to protect the integrity of that case. So they have to be very careful what they release. So I can understand why they're not saying what they found at the crime scene, or should I say in Idaho. We don't know if it was a crime scene or not. Right. But to that point,
and Vincent, I'm sorry to cut you off. I'd also add this. You don't want to jeopardize any other investigation, any other potential defense. Hey, guys, it was great being with you. I'll be in the back next Monday. Vincent, you did an awesome job. Loved having you on, my man.
Always a pleasure, Bob.